On a winter night, my mother asked me to forget what I'd seen. I still think about that winter night more often than I admit. Not because something loud or dramatic happened, but because of how quiet everything felt afterward. The house was wrapped in cold, the kind that seeps through walls and settles into your bones. Even now, years later, that stillness follows me into warm rooms where it doesn't belong. At the time, I was living back in my childhood home, a modest place in a quiet American neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to change. Snow had been falling since dusk, soft and steady, muting the usual sounds outside. The heater hummed unevenly, and the windows fogged with our breath. It felt like one of those ordinary nights you don't expect to remember. My mother had always been the center of that house. She knew everyone's routines, everyone's secrets, everyone's fears. When something went wrong, she was the one who fixed it or made it disappear. I trusted her without thinking, the way you trust gravity to keep you standing. That night, I noticed small things that felt off, though I didn't know why yet. She moved more slowly than usual, her footsteps careful on the wooden floor. She kept checking the hallway, like she was listening for something that never came. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but thinner than I remembered. I remember the smell of cold air clinging to my coat as I stepped inside. My fingers were numb, and I rubbed them together while she watched me in silence. Her eyes lingered on my face longer than normal, like she was measuring something she couldn't quite see. That look unsettled me even then. We didn't argue. There was no raised voice, no slammed door. She simply said my name softly and asked me to sit down. The chair felt hard beneath me, and I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Each second stretched, heavy and slow. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a question. It was a request shaped like concern, wrapped in the language of protection. She told me it would be better for everyone if I forgot what I'd seen. Not denied it, not explained it, just let it fade. I remember nodding, not because I agreed, but because it felt like the only thing I could do. My chest felt tight, and my breathing went shallow. She reached out and rested her hand on mine, warm and steady, like she was grounding herself as much as me. After that, the night resumed its quiet routine. The snow kept falling, the heater kept rattling, and the house settled into sleep. But something inside me stayed awake, alert in a way I had never felt before. I sat there longer than I should have, staring at the pattern in the rug. The fibers were worn thin in places, proof of years of pacing and waiting. My mother busied herself in the kitchen, making quiet noises that felt too deliberate. Cabinets opened and closed with careful precision. I could hear the scrape of a spoon against a mug as she stirred something hot. The smell of instant coffee drifted through the room, bitter and sharp. It was late for coffee, but she drank it anyway. I watched her hands instead of her face. She didn't look at me when she spoke again. She talked about the weather, about the roads being dangerous, about how lucky we were to be safe inside. Each word felt placed like stepping stones across something deep. I answered when I needed to, keeping my voice even. I told myself I was tired, that the long day and the cold had made me sensitive. I leaned into that explanation because it was easier than questioning her. Families survive on those small compromises with reality. When I finally stood up, my legs felt stiff, like I'd been sitting through something important without realizing it. She wished me good night in the same tone she always used. Her hug was firm, familiar, and just a little too long. Upstairs, my room felt smaller than I remembered. The radiator clicked and hissed, struggling against the cold. I lay awake listening to the house breathe, every sound amplified in the dark. I tried to replay the evening, to rearrange it into something harmless. Sleep came slowly, uneven and shallow. When it did, it brought no relief. The night had already done what it needed to do. Even now, when winter comes, I notice how silence can carry weight, how love can ask for things without raising its voice. That was the first time I understood that forgetting isn't always about memory, but about obedience, and how easily it can be requested by someone you love without them ever sounding cruel or unkind. The next day didn't feel like a new day at all. It felt like the same night stretched thin by weak winter light. Snow still covered the ground, untouched, as if the world had decided to pause and wait. My mother was already awake when I came downstairs. She stood by the sink, staring out the window, her back straight and still. The radio was off, which was unusual for her mornings. Silence filled the kitchen, thick and deliberate. She greeted me the same way she always did. Same tone, same small smile. If I hadn't been there the night before, I might have believed nothing had changed. But I could feel the space between her words, the things she wasn't saying. I poured myself coffee and nearly burned my hand. The cup trembled slightly, and I set it down too fast. She noticed that. Her eyes flicked to my hand, then away, like she didn't want to linger. That tiny movement stayed with me. We talked about ordinary things, weather forecasts, errands, bills that needed attention. She spoke carefully, choosing simple topics that didn't invite questions. It felt like she was laying out a path for the day, one where I wouldn't wander too far. At one point, she asked if I'd slept well. I said yes, even though it wasn't true. The lie came easily, and that scared me more than anything else. Felt like practice. She nodded, satisfied, and turned back to the sink. Water ran longer than necessary, splashing softly against the metal. I watched her shoulders rise and fall, slow and controlled. She looked calm, but not relaxed. As the morning went on, I noticed how often she found reasons to stay near me. Folding laundry in the same room, wiping down a counter that was already clean. It wasn't obvious, but it was constant, like she was making sure I stayed within reach. When I mentioned running an errand, she hesitated for half a second too long. Then she smiled and told me to drive carefully. Her voice carried warmth, but her eyes searched my face again, measuring. I wondered what she was looking for. Outside, the cold bit at my cheeks, sharp and sudden. I stood by my car longer than needed, breathing in air that felt cleaner than the house. For a moment, I considered not coming back right away. The thought felt disloyal, and that alone made me uneasy. The errand took less than an hour. When I returned, her car was still in the driveway. Relief and something like disappointment twisted together in my chest. I didn't know which feeling belonged there. Inside, she asked how it went, and I answered with just enough detail to sound normal. She listened closely, nodding at the right moments. Her attention felt heavier than concern. Felt like supervision. That afternoon, she brought up the night before without naming it. She said families survive by protecting each other. That some things only cause harm when they're spoken aloud. Her words were gentle, almost kind. I didn't argue. I sat there, hands folded, listening like I always had. But something inside me resisted, quietly. I realized she wasn't asking if I understood. She was checking whether I would comply. She reminded me how much she'd sacrificed, how hard she'd worked to keep us safe. None of it was untrue. That made it harder. Gratitude mixed with guilt until I couldn't separate them. As evening came, the light faded early, casting long shadows across the living room. She turned on lamps one by one, chasing the dark out of corners. I watched her do it, thinking about how some shadows aren't affected by light at all. When she finally said she trusted me, her voice softened. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they felt like a test I hadn't agreed to take. I nodded again the same way I had the night before. Later, alone in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house settle. Pipes knocked faintly, and wind pressed against the windows. I realized that her request hadn't ended with that conversation. It was still happening. Every smile, every careful sentence, every watchful glance. Forgetting wasn't something she expected overnight. It was something she believed I owed her, slowly, quietly, as proof that I was still hers to guide and keep. Even when the truth stood between us, waiting to be acknowledged, that I used to think our family was simple in the best way. We weren't wealthy, we weren't dramatic, and we didn't draw attention. We were just a regular American household that kept to itself and believed that was enough. For a long time, I took comfort in that. Growing up, the house always felt steady. Same routines, same expectations, same rules that never had to be explained twice. Dinner at the table, voices low, problems handled quietly. If something difficult happened, it stayed inside the family, where my mother said it belonged. She was the reason everything felt held together. My father worked long hours, dependable but distant in that tired way. My mother filled in the gaps, managing emotions as much as schedules. She remembered birthdays, school deadlines, and unspoken tensions before anyone else noticed them. I learned early that she didn't like surprises. Not the fun kind or the uncomfortable kind. She preferred predictability, even if it meant controlling the details herself. At the time, I saw that as care, not caution. Our neighborhood reflected that same controlled calm. Lawns trimmed, porches lit at night, people waving but rarely stopping to talk. It was the kind of place where everyone assumed nothing bad happened because nothing bad was ever discussed. Silence was mistaken for safety. Holidays followed strict patterns. Same decorations, same meals, same conversations repeated year after year. My mother took pride in that consistency. She said traditions kept families strong, gave them roots. I believed her without questioning what those roots might be hiding. There were moments, though, that felt slightly off even back then. Arguments that stopped the second I entered a room. Phone calls my mother took outside, even in the cold. Stories about relatives that changed subtly depending on who was listening. When I asked questions, she answered smoothly. Always enough detail to satisfy me, never enough to invite more. I learned which topics made her tighten her jaw just a little. I learned to step around those without thinking about why. As a child, I thought that was respect. As an adult, I began to see it differently. Avoidance can look a lot like harmony when you're taught not to look closely. My mother had a way of framing things as protection. Don't worry about that. You don't need to know. It's better this way. Her voice never sounded harsh when she said those things. It sounded loving, almost relieved. She was also deeply concerned with how we appeared to others. Not in a shallow way, but in a controlled one. Problems were handled privately. Emotions were managed, not expressed. Anything messy was cleaned up quickly and quietly. I absorbed those values without realizing it. I learned to keep my feelings measured, my reactions small. I learned that loyalty meant agreeing, or at least staying quiet. That lesson stayed with me longer than I'd like to admit. Looking back, I can see how carefully our family story was curated. Which memories were shared and which were gently set aside. Which names were mentioned often and which slowly disappeared from conversation. Nothing felt overtly wrong. That's what made it so effective. There was no single moment that demanded resistance. Just a lifetime of small adjustments, all pointing in the same direction. By the time I reached adulthood, I believed I knew my family completely. I believed there were no real secrets left, only old stories that didn't matter anymore. I trusted that if something serious existed, my mother would have told me. That belief didn't shatter all at once. It cracked slowly, quietly, like ice forming beneath calm water. The winter night when everything changed didn't come out of nowhere. It grew out of years of carefully managed silence. And once I started looking back with new eyes, I realized how much of my understanding had been shaped for me. What I thought was stability had always depended on not asking certain questions. And what I mistook for love had often been control wrapped in reassurance, waiting patiently for obedience rather than truth. There were small things I ignored for years, things that now feel like warning signs I should have recognized. At the time, they seemed trivial or easily explained, little quirks in the rhythm of our household. But now I see them as pieces of a pattern I wasn't ready to understand. My mother had a habit of quietly rearranging our lives without explanation. A school permission slip would disappear from my backpack, only to reappear the next day with instructions I hadn't asked for. A letter from a distant relative would vanish, and when it returned, she had already drafted a response. At the time, I thought it was care. Later, I realized it was control. She monitored conversations subtly. When relatives or neighbors spoke in ways she didn't approve of, she would shift the subject or change the tone of the discussion. No one noticed or no one said anything. I absorbed it, unconsciously learning the rules of what could be said and what couldn't. That quiet redirection always seemed normal then. I remember how she reacted when my father came home late. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was something quieter, an adjustment of the narrative she presented to the rest of the family. His lateness became a minor anecdote about traffic or work stress, never a cause for concern. She managed appearances with such finesse that the truth didn't matter, only perception. Even my own emotions were tempered. When I brought up worries or fears, she would listen just long enough to respond appropriately and then gently guide me away from dwelling. The lessons were subtle. Don't overreact, don't ask too many questions, don't challenge the structure she maintained. It was a lifelong training delivered in kindness. There were inconsistencies in family stories I didn't notice or chose not to notice. A vacation recounted differently depending on who asked, details changing without explanation. Birthdays celebrated quietly some years, loudly others. Small, almost imperceptible contradictions that I brushed aside because they were embedded in love and habit. Some events left a faint sense of unease. A neighbor once mentioned something about a distant cousin I didn't recognize. My mother's smile tightened ever so slightly, and she quickly steered the conversation elsewhere. At the time, I thought it was mere embarrassment. Now, I understand it was a careful closure, a door quietly shut before anyone could step through. I also remember her reaction to news that unsettled me. A television report, a story from a friend, a minor family disagreement. She would take my curiosity and channel it elsewhere. It wasn't a lie, not entirely, just omission and emphasis combined. The truth existed but was selectively shown. Objects in the house had their own subtle messages. Locked drawers, folders tucked away, items moved from plain sight to hidden corners. I never dared to question it, assuming adults had reasons I wouldn't understand. Each small act taught me that some things were off limits, even if I didn't know why. Even celebrations carried hints of control. Holiday gifts were thoughtful but always predictable, designed to fit a narrative of happiness and stability. My reactions were observed, studied, recorded in memory, shaping how I would behave next. Everything had a pattern, even joy. I also noticed how she handled conflict. Not by raising her voice, but by directing attention. If arguments arose, she would ask questions calmly, redirect the blame subtly, and ensure the outcome aligned with her plan. By the time anyone realized the tension, it had been dissolved or shifted. Her concern for our safety extended beyond the physical. I often felt watched, not intrusively, but in a way that implied everything I did mattered. My friendships, my routines, my choices, they all fell within the silent boundaries she established. I thought it was protection. It was, in a sense, but protection from what and for whose benefit? By the end of those years, I had internalized her rules. I had learned not to ask too much, not to probe, and not to linger on questions without immediate answers. And yet, even then, little parts of me resisted. Curiosities I quietly buried, instinctive doubts I ignored. They didn't seem important, until the winter night arrived, carrying with it the moment that would make those ignored signs impossible to forget. I remember the moment vividly, though I wish I could erase it from memory. It wasn't dramatic at first. No crash, no shout, no glaring confrontation. It was quiet, ordinary, almost mundane. But the way it unfolded left an imprint I couldn't shake. I was walking down the hallway late that evening, the house settling into its usual winter silence. The radiator clicked in uneven rhythms, and the floorboards creaked beneath my careful steps. The faint smell of pine from the holiday decorations still lingered in the air, a reminder that the world outside felt safe and familiar. Yet inside, nothing was as it seemed. I paused outside my mother's room. She wasn't there, but something felt off. A shadow of movement from behind the slightly ajar door caught my attention. I stepped closer, curiosity pushing me forward despite the gnawing hesitation in my chest. The small gap in the door allowed me to see just enough to understand that what lay before me wasn't something I was meant to witness. At first, I couldn't process it. My brain refused to fit the pieces together. What I saw contradicted everything I had believed about my family, about my mother, about the home I had trusted. The shock made me freeze, my heart hammering, my breath shallow. I wanted to retreat, to run upstairs and pretend nothing had happened. But something compelled me to stay. The scene wasn't overtly harmful, not in a physical sense, but it carried weight. Weight that pressed on the chest, making each inhale deliberate. I recognized a kind of planning, a careful orchestration that had been invisible to me before. And suddenly, the ordinary comfort of our home felt fragile, like a paper wall waiting for the slightest wind to tear through. I knew immediately that forgetting was no longer an option. Even if I wanted to, my mind had recorded every detail with the clarity of a photograph. The way the light hit certain objects, the subtle expressions, the faint noises of movement that seemed synchronized with the house itself. It was all there, embedded, permanent. My first instinct was denial. Perhaps I had misread it. Perhaps my imagination had filled in the blanks. I backed away slightly, shaking my head. But then came the creeping certainty that I had not imagined it. Every fiber of my being whispered that I had just glimpsed something deliberate, something hidden for a reason. I remember the cold pressing through the hallway again, sharper than before, as if it were aware of the disturbance. My skin tingled where the air touched it, and I shivered, though it wasn't just the temperature. I felt small, exposed, aware of my own vulnerability in a space that had always been familiar. Turning to leave, I caught a glint of her hand on the doorknob as she entered quietly from another room. She paused, looked at me, and gave that faint, unreadable smile she often used when she wanted to calm tension. My chest tightened. I realized then that she knew exactly what I had seen. She didn't speak immediately. There was a stillness, deliberate and precise, as if she were measuring my reaction. Her presence was warm, her eyes steady, but there was an underlying weight, a silent command that suggested I was to do nothing, to speak nothing. At that moment, I understood the enormity of her request from the night before. Forgetting wasn't casual. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a demand enforced with the quiet authority of someone who had shaped my world since birth. Obedience would feel natural. Resistance would be dangerous. I retreated silently, stepping back into the hall, heart racing, ears straining to catch any sound she might make. But there was nothing. Only the house settling again, only the muffled hum of the heater, only the faint whisper of wind against the windows. Alone in my room later, I replayed the image over and over. It wasn't a scene that could be easily described, nor was it something I could dismiss. Every time I tried, it pressed back into my consciousness, demanding attention. It became a silent companion, a secret I could not unlearn. By the end of that night, I understood that the winter silence had a new dimension. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy with knowledge, a weight that settled over the house and over me. And in that heaviness, I realized something fundamental. The life I had assumed I understood had always contained secrets, carefully hidden, waiting for the moment I would stumble upon them. Forgetfulness was no longer possible. Obedience alone couldn't erase the image or the understanding it brought. And in that quiet, I began to see that the world my mother had built, so stable, so controlled, was also fragile, and that my perception of safety had been an illusion carefully maintained. After that night, the house felt different in ways I couldn't explain to anyone else. Nothing had physically changed, yet every familiar corner carried a faint tension. I moved through rooms more slowly, aware of how sound traveled and how easily silence could stretch. The air itself felt watchful. My mother became gentler in small, deliberate ways. She asked if I was eating enough, if I was sleeping well, if I needed anything from the store. Her concern sounded genuine, but it lingered too long, like a hand resting on your shoulder after the comfort has passed. I started noticing how often she checked my face while she spoke. She didn't bring up what I'd seen. Instead, she filled the days with normalcy, as if routine could smooth over memory. Meals arrived on time, laundry folded neatly, conversations kept light. It felt rehearsed, like she was following a script she trusted would work if performed well enough. I began to realize how easily affection could become leverage. When I hesitated or grew quiet, she responded with warmth. A smile, a reminder of everything she'd done for me, a gentle story from my childhood. Each kindness carried an unspoken expectation that I would stay calm, stay grateful, stay silent. At first, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was projecting fear onto care. But patterns emerged the more I paid attention. Whenever my thoughts drifted too close to that night, she seemed to sense it. She would appear nearby, offering distraction, pulling me back into the safety of familiarity. Her questions grew more precise. She asked what I remembered about my childhood, which moments stood out, which people I trusted most. The questions sounded casual, but they landed with intention. I answered carefully, aware that honesty now carried weight. I noticed how she framed our relationship. She spoke often about loyalty, about how families survive by standing together against the world. She reminded me that outsiders never understand the full story. Her voice stayed calm, but the message was clear. Distance equals danger. There were moments when guilt washed over me unexpectedly. She looked tired sometimes, worn in a way I hadn't noticed before. I wondered if knowing what I knew had burdened her as much as it had me. That thought made silence feel like mercy. Still, something inside me resisted. It wasn't loud or brave. It was a quiet discomfort that refused to fade. I started to recognize the difference between care that supports and care that confines. The realization didn't bring clarity. It brought unease. I adjusted my behavior without fully meaning to. I spoke less. I watched more. I kept my expressions neutral, my tone steady. Felt like learning a new language where the wrong word could shift everything. I hated how natural it felt. She seemed satisfied with my compliance. Her posture relaxed. Her smiles returned more easily. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me uneasy. It meant the system was working as designed. At night, I lay awake listening to her footsteps moving through the house. Each sound carried intention I hadn't noticed before. The floor creaked, the stairs sighed, doors closed softly. I wondered how many years she'd navigated this house with secrets I'd never seen. I realized then that manipulation doesn't always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as love practiced carefully over time. That understanding hurt more than anger would have. It reshaped memories I wasn't ready to revisit. By the end of that week, I knew something had shifted permanently. I was no longer just her child. I was a variable she needed to manage. And while she continued to act with warmth and patience, I felt the quiet pressure beneath it all, steady and deliberate, asking not for trust, but for obedience. That I made the decision quietly, without announcing it even to myself. If speaking felt dangerous, then watching felt safer. I stopped trying to resolve my confusion and focused instead on paying attention. Not in an obvious way, but with the kind of patience you develop when you sense that timing matters more than courage. I kept my routines steady so nothing seemed out of place. I woke up when I always had, left the house at the same times, returned with the same casual updates. Normalcy became my cover. Inside, though, I was alert in a way I had never been before, noticing shifts I once would have ignored. My mother continued her careful kindness. She praised small things, thanked me more often than necessary, asked for my opinion on minor decisions. Each gesture felt like reinforcement, like she was rewarding the version of me that stayed agreeable. I accepted it without comment, even when it made my stomach tighten. I started listening more than speaking. I paid attention to how she phrased things, what she avoided, when her voice softened or sharpened. Some topics were still off limits, but others circled close to them without touching. That was where the most information lived. She had habits I'd never questioned before. The way she organized papers, grouping some together and separating others. The way she lingered on phone calls, speaking just loudly enough for me to hear fragments. Felt intentional now, like she wanted me to hear certain things and nothing more. I noticed how she interacted with other family members. She guided conversations subtly, steering them away from anything unpredictable. When someone said too much, she smiled and redirected. No one challenged her. They never had. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when a comment landed too close to the truth, or when I felt the urge to test her reaction. Each time, I stopped myself. I reminded myself that information gathered quietly was more valuable than information forced out prematurely. Being silent took effort. My thoughts raced constantly, filling the space my words left behind. At night, I replayed interactions in my head, examining them from every angle. The house felt louder in those hours, every sound magnified by attention. I began to understand how long she'd been doing this, how much practice it must take to maintain control without appearing to exert it. That realization brought a strange mix of fear and respect. She wasn't improvising. She was experienced. There was also guilt. She had raised me, supported me, shaped my life in countless ways that had nothing to do with secrets. Watching her now felt like betrayal. That conflict wore on me more than the silence ever did. Still, I couldn't ignore the sense that something larger was unfolding, that my role in it wasn't passive, even if it looked that way from the outside. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was choosing restraint. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in a darkened window. I barely recognized the expression on my face. It was neutral, careful, composed. I wondered how long it had been there. The strangest part was how quickly this version of me settled in. Observation became habit. Distance became protection. I adjusted so smoothly that it scared me. By staying quiet, I gave her nothing to react against. By watching, I began to see how everything fit together. The pieces were still scattered, but the pattern was forming. I didn't know yet what I would do with what I learned. I only knew that speaking too soon would change everything. So I stayed still, attentive and patient, letting the truth move on its own, confident it eventually would. It was in the small details that the pattern finally revealed itself. At first, I didn't recognize them as anything more than quirks or coincidences. A misplaced document here, a hushed phone call there, a fleeting glance exchanged between my mother and a relative. But as I pieced these moments together, a larger design began to emerge. I noticed the way she managed information, controlling what anyone could know and when. Even casual conversations had boundaries, invisible lines she expected no one to cross. Her control was subtle, almost invisible, but it was everywhere. Every interaction, every choice, carried a quiet precision I had never noticed as a child. There were times I caught her pausing mid-action, as if weighing a word or movement, even in the privacy of our own home. She wasn't impulsive. She was deliberate. It struck me how much of our lives had been curated under her quiet supervision. It wasn't malicious, not in the traditional sense, but it was strategic, calculated. The realization grew heavier when I looked back on past events. I remembered family disagreements that resolved too neatly, phone calls I had only half heard, stories about distant relatives that never matched. I had dismissed them before as normal quirks of family life, but now they connected. Every small inconsistency fit into a pattern I hadn't seen until I had the eyes to recognize it. I also began to see the layers of protection she had woven around herself and us. Some acts that once seemed harmless, a locked drawer, a folder tucked out of sight, a question she redirected, were not random. They were deliberate safeguards, measures designed to prevent discovery. She had been preparing for moments like the one I experienced, shaping the house, the routines, the information flow, all to manage outcomes she deemed necessary. It wasn't just about secrecy. It was about power. The realization made my stomach tighten. My mother had influence over every corner of the home, every narrative told within it, and every truth I believed I knew. What I had once thought of as care was control dressed in warmth and familiarity. Even the smallest gestures carried weight. The way she offered a cup of tea just before asking a pointed question. The way she lingered near me when I seemed distracted. The way she framed her words to test my reactions without making them obvious. Each action, when connected, painted a picture I could no longer ignore. The more I observed, the more I understood the stakes. This wasn't about casual deception or minor misunderstandings. It was about shaping perception, guiding behavior, and maintaining a certain order at all costs. Her actions weren't haphazard. They were tactical, designed to secure her world and manage the responses of those within it. I found myself retracing my own movements and decisions, realizing how often I had unconsciously followed the paths she set. My choices, my questions, my curiosity, all had been gently, invisibly nudged. What I once thought of as independence now felt like an illusion. This awareness was unsettling but clarifying. The chaos I had imagined as random was not random at all. It was deliberate orchestration, and I had been living within it without noticing. My mother's quiet vigilance extended far beyond what I had ever realized. By the end of that week, I had cataloged enough of these observations to see the pattern clearly. It wasn't just about protecting a secret anymore. It was about maintaining control, shaping reality in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The house, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a carefully constructed stage, and I, for the first time, understood my role. Not as a passive participant, but as an observer of a system I had unknowingly been part of all along. I could feel the tension coiling inside me, but it wasn't panic. It was recognition, a sober acknowledgement of the breadth of her influence. And with that clarity came a new sense of resolve, an awareness that seeing the pattern meant I could no longer ignore it. By noticing these subtle, precise behaviors, I finally understood that my family's reality had been carefully managed for years. Everything fit together now, each small act confirming the quiet power my mother wielded. The pattern wasn't just visible, it was undeniable. And in that truth, I felt the first stirrings of my own agency, the first understanding that observation could be as powerful as obedience. Knowing too much changes the air around you. It's subtle at first, like a pressure shift before a storm, but once you feel it, you can't ignore it. After I recognized the pattern, the house no longer felt neutral. It felt reactive, as if it could sense my awareness and was adjusting accordingly. My mother didn't accuse me of anything. She didn't confront me or demand reassurance. Instead, she grew watchful in a new way, less nurturing and more precise. Her questions became fewer, but more pointed. Each one felt like a quiet inventory of where I stood. I realized then that knowledge had a cost. Not an immediate one, but a slow, accumulating weight. I was no longer just someone to protect or guide. I was someone who might disrupt the balance she had maintained for so long. That shift, though unspoken, changed everything. The isolation began gently. Invitations to join errands stopped coming. Family conversations continued without me, just out of earshot. It wasn't exclusion in the obvious sense. It was subtle redirection, the kind that leaves you unsure whether anything has changed at all. I noticed how often she spoke for me when others were around. She answered questions before I could, explained my thoughts, filled in emotional gaps I hadn't expressed. On the surface, it looked like familiarity. Underneath, it felt like containment. I became careful with my words, aware that even neutral statements could be interpreted. Silence felt safer, but it also made me invisible. That invisibility wasn't accidental. It reduced my influence, softened my presence, made me easier to manage. There were moments when I felt like a guest in my own home. I'd enter a room and sense that something had just ended. The air would settle too quickly, conversations restarting with unrelated topics. No one looked guilty. No one looked surprised. Sleep became difficult. My mind replayed interactions, searching for signs I might have missed. The house sounded different at night, every movement carrying intent. I wondered how long she'd been aware of my awareness. I considered leaving just to create space. But that felt like surrendering ground I didn't yet understand. Staying meant discomfort, but it also meant proximity. Distance, I suspected, would only make it easier for her to reshape the story. I began to feel the threat of erasure, not physical but narrative. The idea that my perspective could be quietly dismissed, reframed, or replaced. That realization frightened me more than confrontation ever could. My mother remained composed throughout it all. She laughed at the right moments, showed concern when expected, fulfilled every visible role perfectly. If anyone had looked closely, they would have seen nothing wrong. That was the point. I watched her manage others with the same calm efficiency she always had. But now I saw the mechanisms behind it. I saw how easily perception could be guided, how gently doubt could be planted or removed. There were times I questioned myself. Maybe I was misreading things. Maybe awareness had made me paranoid. That uncertainty was exhausting, and I understood then how powerful it was as a tool. The danger wasn't in what she might do, but in what she could convince others of. The ability to define reality, to decide which truths mattered and which could be buried. I felt exposed in a way I'd never experienced before. Still, beneath the fear, something steady formed. A resolve born not of anger, but of clarity. I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't unknow what I knew. That made me vulnerable, but it also made me deliberate. By understanding the cost, I began to understand the stakes. Silence was no longer neutral. Neither was speech. Every choice carried consequence now, and I had to learn how to move carefully within that reality. Aware that knowing too much had placed me somewhere dangerous, but not powerless, I didn't realize at first that I was being prepared. The signs were subtle, layered into ordinary moments, easy to dismiss if you weren't looking closely. But once I saw them, I couldn't unsee the direction they pointed in. My mother began speaking about the past differently. Stories she had told 100 times were suddenly softened, edited, or reframed. Details were smoothed out, motivations clarified in ways that favored her version of events. It felt like watching someone quietly rewrite a script while pretending nothing had changed. She talked more often about memory, about how unreliable it could be. She mentioned studies she'd read, stories she'd heard, examples of people remembering things wrong and suffering for it. The conversations sounded casual, almost thoughtful, but they landed with purpose. Each one nudged the idea that certainty was dangerous. I noticed how she positioned herself as the steady narrator. When family members disagreed about the past, she stepped in gently, offering clarification. No one challenged her. Why would they? She sounded reasonable, confident, concerned only with harmony. There were moments when she reminded others of my stress, my sensitivity, my tendency to overthink. She did it kindly, almost protectively. I could see how easily that framing would stick, how it would shape how anything I said might later be received. At first, the realization made me angry. Then it made me cautious. I understood that this wasn't about silencing me outright. It was about preemptively shaping how my voice would be heard if I ever used it. She also began encouraging me to rest more, to take things easy. She suggested I might be burned out, overwhelmed by living back at home. Her concern felt genuine, but it also positioned me as fragile, someone whose perceptions might be compromised. I paid attention to how often she used phrases like, "You remember how that was?" or "We both know." They weren't questions. They were assertions, subtle claims of shared understanding that left little room for disagreement. I realized she was building a cushion around herself, a narrative buffer. If I ever spoke up, there would already be explanations waiting. Doubt wouldn't need to be planted. It would already be there. That understanding changed how I behaved. I became more deliberate, less reactive. I stopped pushing against the edges of conversations and let them flow past me. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to give her anything useful. There was a strange calm in that restraint. I felt less exposed once I understood the strategy. Fear gave way to focus. I wasn't trapped. I was learning the terrain. One evening, she spoke about trust in a way that lingered. She said families depend on it, that once broken, it can't be repaired. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't need to. I understood then that she wasn't waiting for me to forget. She was preparing for the possibility that I wouldn't. And in doing so, she was quietly securing her position, ensuring that if the truth ever surfaced, it would arrive already questioned. That realization didn't make me reckless. It made me patient. I knew now that timing mattered more than impulse. That clarity, unsettling as it was, gave me something solid to stand on. By recognizing the preparation for silence, I also recognized my own responsibility. If I ever chose to speak, it would have to be carefully, deliberately, and on my terms. Until then, I watched, listened, and held on to what I knew, understanding that awareness itself was the first real step toward reclaiming control. That it took time for me to understand that what she had asked me to forget was never just about me. For a long while, I thought the burden was personal, something I alone had stumbled into by accident. But the more I reflected, the clearer it became that the truth reached far beyond my own memory. I began to notice how others around her behaved, especially those who had known her for decades. There was a carefulness in them I hadn't questioned before. Certain topics were avoided instinctively, like everyone had agreed on rules without ever discussing them. I realized I wasn't alone in sensing those boundaries. I was just late to understanding why they existed. Looking back, I could see moments where people had quietly stepped away from her orbit. Friends who faded out over the years. Relatives who stopped visiting as often. At the time, it had seemed natural, the way relationships sometimes drift. Now it felt deliberate, as if distance was the only safe option once you saw too much. The truth she wanted buried wasn't contained to a single night or a single action. It was layered, accumulated over years of decisions made in private. Decisions that shaped other lives without their full knowledge. That realization made my chest tighten in a different way than fear ever had. I thought about the times people had come to her for help. She was always the fixer, the mediator, the one who knew how to handle things quietly. I had admired that. Now I wondered how often help had come with conditions, how often solutions had required silence in return. The weight of that possibility was heavier than anger. It meant acknowledging that harm doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind reassurance, behind the promise that everything will be fine if you just don't ask too many questions. I began to understand why she had been so calm when she asked me to forget. She wasn't improvising. She had done this before in one way or another. She knew how to guide people back into compliance, how to frame silence as the kinder choice. That realization shifted something inside me. The decision I faced was no longer about protecting myself alone. It was about whether I was willing to become another person shaped by that silence. Another participant in maintaining a version of reality that benefited her at the expense of others. I felt the pull of loyalty stronger than ever. She was still my mother. She had still raised me, cared for me, given me a life that, in many ways, had been good. Acknowledging the truth didn't erase any of that. It just complicated it. But silence, I realized, was also a choice. One that carried its own consequences. Every time I considered letting it go, I pictured how easily the pattern would continue. How nothing would change except that I would know, and I would live with that knowledge alone. The truth didn't demand drama. It didn't ask for confrontation or revenge in the way people imagine it. It asked for acknowledgement, for refusal to participate in erasure. That felt both smaller and heavier than anything else. I spent long nights thinking about responsibility, about whether knowing something obligates you to act, even when action risks loss. I understood then why so many people choose silence. It offers the illusion of peace. But peace built on denial isn't stable. It cracks quietly, spreading beneath the surface until it reaches everything. I had seen that firsthand. I had lived inside it. By accepting that what she wanted me to forget affected more than just my own conscience, I also accepted that I couldn't unsee the larger picture. The truth belonged to more than one life, more than one story. And whether I spoke or not, it existed. That understanding didn't bring relief. It brought clarity. And with clarity came resolve. I didn't yet know exactly what justice would look like, or how quietly it could be achieved. I only knew that forgetting was no longer an option, not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. In that realization, something steadied inside me. I wasn't acting out of anger or a desire to punish. I was acting out of refusal. Refusal to let silence continue shaping lives without consent. Refusal to become another carefully managed memory. What she asked me to forget had never belonged solely to me. And once I understood that, the choice ahead of me, difficult as it was, finally felt unavoidable. That I didn't take revenge in the way people expect when they hear that word. There were no confrontations, no raised voices, no dramatic scenes where everything spilled out at once. What I did instead was quiet, deliberate, and patient, shaped by everything I had learned from watching her. I started by organizing what I knew, not emotionally but practically. Dates, patterns, documents, conversations I could verify without relying on memory alone. I kept everything factual, stripped of interpretation. I understood that emotion would only weaken what I was trying to do. I didn't accuse her. I didn't warn her. I didn't threaten. I let her continue believing that silence had worked, that I had settled back into the role she expected of me. That belief gave me space to move without interference. I reached out carefully to people she had quietly managed for years, not to expose her but to ask questions, neutral ones, questions that allowed them to speak without feeling cornered. I listened more than I talked, letting them draw their own connections. What surprised me was how ready some of them were, not to act, but to acknowledge. Small confirmations, hesitant admissions, shared discomforts that had never been named. I realized then how many people had carried pieces of the truth alone, unsure whether anyone else would recognize them. I chose formal paths where possible. Documentation instead of accusation. Procedures instead of confrontation. Systems that didn't rely on belief or persuasion, only consistency and record. It was slow, but it was stable. When consequences began to surface, they were quiet. Responsibilities shifted. Authority narrowed. Certain narratives lost traction when they were no longer reinforced. Nothing collapsed overnight. Control simply weakened. My mother noticed the changes before anyone else. She didn't ask me about them directly. She watched, recalculated, adjusted. I could see her trying to understand where the pressure was coming from. There were moments when she looked tired in a way that felt different than before. Less in control, less certain. I didn't take satisfaction in that. I took it as confirmation that the structure she relied on was no longer airtight. I never confronted her with the full truth. I didn't need to. She knew. She had always known. What mattered was that she could no longer contain it completely. When she spoke about family and loyalty, I listened without responding. When she hinted at sacrifice, I let the words pass. I no longer felt compelled to reassure her. The quiet revenge wasn't about punishment. It was about balance, about returning agency to places where it had been quietly removed, about refusing to participate in the maintenance of a single, controlled version of reality. There was loss in it. Relationships changed. Distance settled in places where closeness had once existed. I accepted that as part of the cost. Silence had also carried a cost. This one felt more honest. In the end, nothing about my life became dramatic or public. There was no final reckoning anyone could point to, just a gradual shift, a reordering of influence, a loosening of control. And in that quiet outcome, I found something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, but steadiness. A sense that I had acted without becoming cruel, that I had chosen truth without spectacle. It wasn't the kind of revenge people tell stories about, but it was the kind that lasts because it doesn't rely on anger to sustain it. It relies on clarity, patience, and the refusal to forget what was never meant to be erased. In the years since that winter, I've learned that resolution doesn't always look like closure. There was no final conversation where everything was laid bare, no apology that tied the story into something neat and understandable. What I found instead was distance, and with it, perspective. The house eventually stopped feeling like a place I needed to defend myself in. Not because it changed, but because I did. I learned how to carry what I knew without letting it define every interaction. That wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't forgetting. It was acceptance of reality as it was, not as I wished it had been. My relationship with my mother settled into something quieter and more limited. We spoke about ordinary things, shared meals, acknowledged milestones. But there was an understanding beneath it all, unspoken and firm. Certain lines would not be crossed again. Control had lost its reach. I came to see that justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as truth that can no longer be fully contained. Sometimes it arrives as boundaries that didn't exist before. That kind of justice doesn't announce itself, but it changes the shape of everything. I thought often about loyalty, how easily it can be confused with silence. Growing up, I had believed that protecting family meant not asking questions, not challenging narratives. Now I understood that real loyalty includes honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. There were moments of grief I hadn't expected. Grief for the version of my mother I once believed in. Grief for the simplicity of ignorance. Letting go of those things felt like losing something fundamental, even if what replaced them was more real. But there was also relief. Relief in no longer doubting my own perceptions. Relief in knowing I had acted in alignment with what I believed was right, without cruelty or spectacle. That mattered to me more than proving anything to anyone else. Winter still affects me differently now. The quiet nights, the early darkness, the way sound carries in cold air. They remind me how easily stillness can hide weight. How important it is to listen to discomfort instead of explaining it away. What I learned most is that forgetting is rarely about memory. It's about choice. About whether we allow ourselves to be shaped by someone else's version of reality, or whether we claim our own, even when it costs us something. I don't tell this story to condemn my mother, or to invite judgment. I tell it because silence thrives on isolation, because there are people listening who have been asked gently and lovingly to forget something that matters. If that's you, I want you to know this. Noticing is not betrayal. Remembering is not cruelty. And choosing clarity doesn't make you disloyal. It makes you honest. If the story resonated with you, if you've lived through something similar or are still trying to understand it, you're not alone. These stories don't always have clear villains or easy endings, but they deserve to be told. If you found value in this story, consider supporting the channel by liking the video. It helps more people find stories like this one. And if you want to hear more true, slow-burn stories about family, betrayal, and quiet justice, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to forget, and choose instead to live with our eyes open.